This is the Uncle Larry Tombukovac 5E3 Deluxe Homage built by P2P amps. And it looks great from this side. And every time a boutique hand-wired thing comes in, especially when associated with a name player, I always worry, what am I going to find? Do I have to be the bearer of realistic news, or can I be nice? And I am delighted to say, that I can be very, very positive about this amp. It is really well done. Let's turn this around and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So let's go through the back of the amp on an overview level, and then we'll get to some nitty-gritty stuff. First, let's be very clear. There's actual criticisms, being critical. There's evaluating what things are, and being evaluative. And then there's just theoretical shop talk. When designing amps, you could go this way or that way. Both work. They have pros and cons. A couple places I would have zagged where they zigged. But overall, these are just shop talks and evaluative notes. I don't have any real criticisms. I do have one strong suggestion for the builders, but more on that later. So let's start with the general overview. I've got a JJ5Y3, a JJ ECC83, a very nice Switchcraft plug, just enough clearance to get over the bell of this Alnico Gold speaker, pair of JJ6V6S's, and in this case, an new old stock Silvertone branded 5Y3. All belt and tube sockets, done very well with the belt and bear traps, very nice. Switchcraft jacks throughout, everything's done neatly. All the hardware is tight. I did not have to tighten anything. I did double check that. Very neat lead dress over here in the power section, where a lot of times amps are just spaghetti junction. The board is worth the price of admission alone. It is a piece of fiberglass. It is not old fiberboard the way Fender used, so it will not warp. It will not start to absorb moisture. It will not leak DC. Very high quality eyelets, and the spacing on the eyelets is correct spacing for modern resistors, which are not as long as the ones used in the early and mid and late 50s, where the board spacing could be from here to here, and modern resistors barely reach, if they reach at all. So nice change to use modern components. It's got 22 nanofarad input coupling cap, not input, but coupling caps on the first gain stages. The original had 100. This is going to slightly eliminate a little bit of mud. It's not a noticeable change. Pretty much everything in the guitar frequency range and an octave below is still present with a 22 versus 100. There's a slight difference at the very lowest volume settings with a 22 versus 100, but at playing levels, you're not going to notice the difference. It's just going to be whether you've got a whole bunch of stuff down at 10 hertz versus stuff down around 30 hertz. Good quality caps. As a matter of shop talk, not a criticism, I have found that the modern Sprague Atom caps are not as well built as they used to be, and they are certainly physically oversized and expensive for what they are. I would have used MOD or FNT, but these seem to be working fine. So again, shop talk. Got what looks to be an Illinois capacitor here. Now, IC caps are made by CDE, Cornell Dubier, and IC makes some very high quality caps. They also make the cheap ones that Fender uses. This is not one of the cheap series that Fender uses. So in a deviation from the original, it's got 33 for the first stage versus 22 or 16, then dual 16s. This is rated for 450 volts. These are rated for 500 volts. It's all right, 475, sorry. I have about to say I need new glasses. I've got new glasses. I need to use them better. Anyway, so this is all fine for a 5E3. Little more ripple reduction, a little more solid low end with a 33 here. These could be all 22s. These could be dual 16s and a 32 or a 33 or a 30. You won't really hear much difference. This is well done. Using some, looks to be 1 watt and 2 watt metal oxides here and there. All the stuff in the signal path are 1/2 watt carbon films. Very neat lead dress throughout. They've got the heaters up here, away from all the wires going to the grids. The old ones had all the heater wires laid out on the bottom of the chassis, which is how they did it. So, it's vintage correct, but it certainly traps a lot of dust, if nothing else. and also means that the grid connections can be really close to the heater connections. By getting up in the air this way, it gets the heaters farther away from the grid connections, and the amp, as a result, has a very low noise floor for a 5E3. Most people already know this, but starting in about 60, 61, Fender went to doing all the heaters up in there like this anyway. They've got an artificial center tap here off the lamp for the heaters, and that goes over here to this point, which is shared with the HD center tap and this first ground bus, which is used for the screen, reservoir, and output cathode grounds. So all three of these are going over here to that point right there. And everything else in the preamp is going along this bit of good bus wire all along here and going to chassis right down here. So this is one of the ways to do it. There are about 3 good ways to do it. This is one of them, and I have no problems with it whatsoever. Before I get to the reason this amp came in for service, I want to point out the one reservation I have with this circuit, which is the standby switch. Now, P2P amps are run by Mike Skaggs in Nashville, and I actually spoke to Mike before recording this video because I didn't want to blindside him with anything, and I wanted to make sure that he and I both knew that when I said this part of the video, that this was shop talk on the verge of it's a suggested change. It's an evaluation. It's not really a criticism. I'm not pantsing the guy. Everything else about this is done great. He's got the hot coming into the fuse and going to the switch, and the neutral's going right to the primary. The ground's slightly longer than the others. Everything I always point out all the time, he's getting it right. It's all to code. The one thing I don't care for in this amp is where the standby switch is in the circuit. He has a standby switch hung off the rectifier tube, pin 8, and it goes to the standby, and from there it goes to the HD center tap the output transformer center tap, and it goes to the reservoir right here. And theoretically, and I have seen this happen in older amps, if you have an amp which has been powered off for a long time, and there is absolutely no voltage stored in the reservoir cap, at the moment, and you power the amp up in standby, at the moment that you switch it out of standby, for a few milliseconds, maybe even less, before this begins to have a trickle charge and voltage builds up in this cap, for just a very short period of time, this capacitor appears to this tube as a dead short, and it can stress out rectifier tubes. Now, Mike says he's built about 200 of these. This is a very early example, by the way, and he's never had that problem, and that I believe him. I'm not saying that it always nukes rectifier tubes. I'm saying that I have seen rectifier tubes fail commonly in amps where the standby is used this way. So there are 2 fixes. Number 1, don't use the standby. It's not necessary in a 5E3. 3 fixes. Number 2, bypass the standby and wire this as a mute that just mutes the input of the phase inverter over here. Number 3, move the connections. And when I spoke to Mike, it's my suggestion for future builds, move the standby switch so you're interrupting this node from the reservoir cap to the first dropper, which takes the place of a choke. So this is where you would interrupt it. This would always be charged whenever voltage comes out of the rectifier tube. This cap would fill up. That's what they did in the Super Reverb and the Deluxe Reverb and other Fenders from the 60s. I think if you're going to have standby in an amp that does not need standby, it needs to be wired in such a way that it cannot ever cause a known issue. Again, it's a strong suggestion. It's not a criticism. If you have one of these Uncle Larry amps, don't feel the need to make a change. But remember that you don't need standby on this amp with this 5Y3 tube rectifier. You will have there's no such thing as cathode stripping in these amps. You're not going to hurt anything. The only consideration is whether the unloaded B+, as in the B+ present in the amp before the output tubes draw current, is higher than the ratings of the filter caps. So in this case, 450 would be the lowest value. These are 475s. And with a 5Y3 and this power transformer, that's unlikely. A. B, with the tube rectifier, the 5Y3 has a max output, I think, of like 350 volts. So you're never going to come close to exceeding the value of this, even if these tubes aren't here. And you won't have any B+ flowing out of this tube until this tube is heated up. And this tube takes longer to heat up than these tubes. So by the time any voltage is coming out of this tube. These tubes are already operating and will be drawing current. So again, standby is not necessary. Doc, it hurts when I do this. Don't do that. Let's take a peek at the man behind the curtain as far as why people like me and people like Mike sometimes make the decisions we make. I said, the amp doesn't need standby. He said, I know, but the company I buy the chassis from already has that hole and it's already labeled standby, so I put it in there. And you know what? Of course, that's how the world has to work. I almost forgot to mention the amp's got a 3-position negative feedback switch. So in this position, it's the standard 5E3. So this cathode of this stage is bypassed by this capacitor. In the middle, that capacitor is lifted, and this resistor is still in circuit at all times. So that's the medium gain. So highest gain is both of them together. Medium gain is just this resistor, and lowest gain switches in the negative feedback from here, which also goes to here. So it puts the negative feedback tied into here. In positions 2 and 3, middle and lowest gain, this cap is always out of circuit. I promise I'll show you the issue the amp came in for in just a second, but I wanted to point out how good the solder joints are in this amp. And Mike says he builds every one of these by hand, and I believe him. When people talk about hand-wired amps, I'm always asking, yeah, but whose hands? It matters. Mike's hands. I can endorse Mike's hands, and that would sound so strange in any other context, but he does good work. As to the problem the amp came in for, the owner said, hey, the volumes don't work below right about there. And I said, well, I know exactly what the problem is before I even opened it up. They used CTS 1 meg audio taper pots. And CTS makes really high quality pots, and I use them for an awful lot of things. But their 1 meg and their 500K audio taper pots all have that dropout below about 8:45, almost 9 o'clock. There's just nothing there. I'll let you see it, or hear it rather. Same for this channel. So the transition from off to fairly loud is abrupt, and right in between there's a spot where it just sounds awful. And it's not because CTS makes bad pots, but the standard audio taper pots they make use the same carbon tracks that they use in their switched pots. So their switch pots, switch off here. So they don't have anything in this part. So the pot is designed to go from 7 o'clock down here to about 5 o'clock down to about 9 o'clock, and then power off. And since that's what they do, there's just nothing here by design. And I asked Mike, and Mike said, yeah, I stopped using them for that reason. Again, this is an early version of this model. And I said, well, what do you use now? Burns, PEC, Alpha? He uses Alpha. So I'm going to put some Alpha 1 meg audio tapers in here, and it'll go from nothing to a little bit of sound and gradually come up without that abrupt, kind of grainy transition point, which nobody likes. The other change I'll be making is relatively minor. After talking to Mike, he said he put this bit of felt on the back of the chassis so the rear panel wouldn't vibrate, but especially with modern electronics in the world, it can be very susceptible to radio noise. So now he put some shielding on the back, and he puts a screw with a ground lug and a wire that goes to that bus right there. And I said I'd be glad to do the same thing for this owner. It's relatively easy to do, and I'm glad that is a change that he's making. Another thing to point out, just on this note, the importance of shielding. I'm going to move the mic so that it is much closer, and I want you to listen. Here's the self noise when the panel's in place, but I'm not touching anything metal. Hopefully you hear that it went up. This is quieter than this. But the quietest is if I'm touching metal like this, at which point the entire chassis is shielded by my body. That's the same effect having some metal shielding here tied to the ground will provide. It'll provide shielding to that last missing plane and make the amp much quieter. Anyway, it's nice to be the bearer of rare good news, and we'll check back on this otherwise excellent amp once those pots have been changed out. Until then, thanks for watching.